Hello, everybody. My name is Eli Lake. I'm with Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and I am joined today with Dr. John Mueller, the co-author with his colleague from Australia, Mark Stewart, of Terror, Security, and Money. Thanks so much for being here today, John.
Great to be here.
So let's just start off. Why don't you talk about some of the unique research that you've done tallying the cost of the United States of Homeland Security, and explain how you got to the figure that if you add everything, including opportunity costs, it has been about $1 trillion just in Homeland Security since 9/11.
Yeah, that's just the domestic Homeland Security.
Yes.
Well, we basically started out, Mark and I did, with the idea that we do some critique the Department of Homeland Security risk analysis. After all, they're spending a lot of money, and they presumably were doing some studies which indicated why they came to the conclusions and they spent money in a certain way rather than a different way.
Right.
We looked really hard, and we basically couldn't find any studies at all. And then we were sort of helped in some respects because Congress a couple of years ago put together a commission from the National Academy of Sciences to investigate exactly the issue. And they concluded in a report just last year that DHS basically had not done any analysis that justified any of their decisions. So we decided we'd basically do it if no one else was doing it, particularly within DHS. So we basically started by just tallying the costs that have taken place over the last 10 years, and including opportunity costs, but including not only the Department of Homeland Security expenditures, but things by the Defense Department, Justice Department, and as well as state and local governments, and also private industry and private business. The costs easily exceed $1 trillion. Over that 10 years, and essentially over that period, no one had really been looking carefully, analytically at the money expended. And this is really impressive because DHS, as this National Academy report points out, is state-of-the-art in terms of dealing with natural hazards, earthquakes and hurricanes and floods and so forth. And so they have the people there who know how to do it and are doing it world-class work with it. They had never applied those same skills toward terrorism, and we find this is a real lack, and particularly when you're dealing with something as important as public safety, and particularly when you're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on that over a course of time.
Yes, and I want to let's get into the numbers here, and I want to just stress to the viewers that this is not including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not including the unmanned aerial vehicles. It's not including the money that we spend to research, develop, and put satellites into space, or overseas intelligence, or all of the kinds of things that happen abroad that are connected to the war on terror. It is just those Homeland Security, right?
Yeah, just the domestic cost of Homeland Security within the United States comes to about $1 trillion over 10 years.
Right. So let's just talk. Maybe you can kind of break that down and kind of talk about the expenditures on the federal, sort of state, and then versus what you've described in academic papers as might be called opportunity costs.
Yeah, well, the breakdown basically is that within the federal government generally, about 45% is spent on policing and intelligence within the country. Mm-hmm. Another 45% or so is spent on protection of what they call critical infrastructure or key resources. Another 10%, relatively small amount, on resilience and mitigation of the effects of a terrorist attack. So that's the general spread.
And what counts as resilience and mitigation?
Resilience would be basically helping people so that if there is an attack, they're able to bounce back.
Right.
And mitigation would be like having more emergency facilities in the hospital. If attack does take place, we're able to reduce save lives because we've got better facilities for dealing with people. For example, that'd be one case of it.
Right, but we also kind of lose money from your calculation by having, longer, kind of wait times at the border with Canada and Mexico, and more risk premiums, terrorism premiums on our various kinds of commercial insurance, not to mention all of the added costs of airline travel that are associated with post 9/11 Homeland Security, right?
Yeah, there's various people have estimated the cost of just increasing security waiting time in airports. Right. And that adds up, it's not very much per person, but of course there's a huge number of people flying. and the total becomes pretty significant. So we put that together. There's also sort of the transaction costs and dead weight losses associated with any kind of government program. So basically, the direct cost, the real spending is maybe 2/3 of a trillion, and then there's another third or so of a trillion from these other opportunity costs, and we don't deal with all of them. I mean, there's even some issue about, for example, people being killed on the highway after 9/11 because they drove rather than flew. We didn't fly. We didn't include that.
Right. Okay. Now let's talk about your point about the risk assessment. You think this is all poorly spent resources. Is that right?
A great deal of it. The appalling thing is they haven't done the analysis after spending this money. What you need to do in this case is evaluate the risk, which basically involves just basically 4 or 5 variables. One is, what's the likelihood there'll be an attack on, say, a target you're trying to protect? Second, what are the consequences of that? Third is, how much will this security measure, like putting up a guard, reduce the risk? And then you multiply those 3 things together, and you compare that to the cost of the security measure. And if the cost of the security measure is bigger than the multiplying the other 3 together, it is not cost effective. Now, this is a totally standard technique. We're not trying to push any envelopes or come up with fancy new models. What we're doing, and all of this is really very simple, very readable and understandable to any intelligent reader. What we're trying to do is just simply apply what people have been using for decades. It's codified internationally as the way to assess risk, and it simply hasn't been done. The biggest issue, as far as we're concerned, is what we call probability neglect, picking a phrase from Cass Sunstein, a risk analyst who's now working in the Obama administration, actually.
Yeah.
What we're finding is that they simply just ignore substantially the whole issue of what's the likelihood of an attack, and they simply focus on what would happen, what's the worst thing that could happen if something did happen, if there were an attack. And that's just bad analysis. You can't do risk analysis without evaluating risk.
If we were to, say, treat terrorism the way that we treat earthquakes, how would that change the way we think about homeland security, in your view?
Well, because we're spending a lot less money, I think.
Okay.
Because the probability of an attack on any given target is extremely low. And so consequently, if you multiply an extremely low probability into any kind of equation, you tend to come up with a very small number. And so one of the reasons for ignoring probability, I think, is because of the danger, in some respects, perhaps the danger of that. That people will multiply it in and find out that there's no justification for the spending they want to do. So an easy way out of that, of course, is simply ignore the problem by not considering the likelihood of an attack.
Do you think it's even possible to harden all of the potential targets that terrorists would want to attack? I mean, is that even something that's feasible, assuming that it's something that people wanted to do?
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not remotely. Though DHS does say that we can't provide perfect protection and so forth, so they do admit that. But they don't carry out their processes. Well,
presumably they do some assessment, given they cannot protect every possible target, because it could, it's endless, right? They do, I think, what they consider kind of an intelligence-based approach to like how they do this stuff based on what they're getting in terms of the threat and stuff like that.
Yeah, but you have to deal with the absolute probabilities. What they tend to do is they rank risk or rank the probabilities rather than calculating them. So, for example, they consider New York to be a more likely target than, say, Columbus, Ohio. But New York is also more likely to be struck by a tsunami rather than Columbus, Ohio. And so what you want to know is before you spend a lot of money protecting New York from tsunamis, is not simply saying that it's more likely to be hit by a tsunami than Columbus, Ohio, but you want to know what the likelihood it's going to be struck is. And the same basically with terrorism. So when you look at the real value, what's the likelihood of it actually striking any given target, you come out with spectacularly low numbers.
I'm correct. It's a chance of one in 3.5 million. Is that it?
Yeah. If you look at just sort of what's the place much of the analysis should really start is exactly with that number. What's the likelihood that an American will be killed by a terrorist, and it comes out to be one chance in 3.5 million per year.
Right.
So the second question then is, if your chances of being killed are 1 in 3.5 million per year, how much money do you want to spend to make that even lower, given that there are a lot of hazards, which of course kill far more people than terrorism? You could also argue that we're using historical data here, looking back in the past, including not only 9/11, but things like Timothy McVeigh's attack in Oklahoma City. And you could argue that it's going to get much worse in the future, in which case history is not much of a guide. But of course, what DHS has been saying is that the risk will be going down, because now they're saying we don't have to worry that much about big Al-Qaeda 9/11 type attacks, but we have to worry about small homegrown attacks or lone wolf attacks. Now, those can be bad and they can be tragic, and they can certainly cost lives, but they're not going to change the data series very much. The total number of people killed by that is likely to be quite low. So the basic probability is, according to what they're saying, is unlikely to change very much.
Well, let me push back a little bit now. And I think we've gotten kind of the general thesis of the book and the result of the research. And I guess what I think some people might say is that you can't really compare terrorism to earthquakes or car accidents, because terrorism is a deliberate act as a form of warfare. And in that respect, it's different than sort of natural disasters or things that, you know, are terrible and fatal, but they do not, they may cause the same amount of harm, but it's just, you have to put something in a different category if there is a group that is seeking to kind of cause, mass death and destruction versus the random chances of that happening through lightning striking or something like that. What do you say to that?
Well, we take that into consideration. There's actually a study that was done for DHS by some risk analysts at Harvard, and what there's a standard kind of idea, which is basically the VSL, value of a saved life, or value of a statistical life.
Right.
And generally speaking, lives are valued in this form basically between $1 and $10 million each.
Right.
And that's a very standard thing, and I can go into a lot of detail if you want, and there's quite a bit of it in the book explaining where these come from and a lot of comparisons. Sure. But the DHS own study said that if for terrorism, a reasonable estimate would be maybe $6.5 million per saved life. And if you can save one life, that's certainly worth spending $6.5 million. And then they add what you just suggested, because of the fear factor and because of ancillary problems, like people don't go to go to restaurants and there's a potential hit on the economy, that number for terrorism might be doubled. And that's essentially what we do. We don't quite do it in the way that they suggest, but effectively we consider these ancillary costs, indirect costs, the effect on the economy, effect on airline travel, and things like that. So, again, that's a standard thing. You can't simply assume that all lives are infinitely valuable. If they did, you'd presumably be in favor of reducing the speed limit on private passenger automobiles to 13 miles per hour. If you did that, you would save 30,000 lives every year. Right. Effectively, what we're saying by having automobiles is that it's worth 30,000 lives to have these, to be able to get there faster by private passenger automobile. So we take these risks. We understand these problems are there, and what we also do is, in the case of automobile traffic, is spend tons of money trying to reduce that danger, that risk lower. And there's been quite a bit of success over the course of the 20th century. Nonetheless, the price is still very high to have to have automobiles in existence.
Okay, so let's talk. We've been talking about homeland security. Have you done any kind of research on the other side of this equation, which is, since 9/11, the United States has increased dramatically its footprint and its lethal operations really all over the world, not just in the two wars that are declared, but also in Pakistan and Yemen through cooperation with intelligence services. Have you done any kind of thinking and research on that side of it as well?
Not so much the international costs. They're very high, even higher, of course, than domestic.
Right.
And some of that probably is cost effective. That is to say, it's gotten some really bad guys at a reasonable cost.
So your view is actually that you kind of think that's a different category because that's part of a war.
Yes, but that still doesn't guarantee it's a wise policy or anything. But we haven't really looked at it. We've looked basically at domestic costs, and those tend to be, every place we look tends to be very questionable from a cost-benefit analysis standpoint.
Okay. I guess I want to, okay, so because I wanted to kind of compare, that's interesting that you sort of said that you haven't looked at it yet, but like you could sort of say, well, at least in the international stuff, you can say, bin Laden is dead. Recently they got Unisal Mauritani, who's now under question, and you can point to, fewer Al-Qaeda senior leaders that are, to use the phrase the intelligence and the military uses, taken off the battlefield. And you can say that that's at least a matrix of success. What would be the matrix of success for the Homeland Security spending, other than what Richard Clarke famously described as a self-looking ice cream cone, which is that either you do a great job and therefore all of the spending is necessary in Washington kind of budget parlance, or you do a terrible job and therefore you need even more money, right?
Yeah, that's the argument, right? If it's successful, if there's no attacks, you say, well, we must be spending the money right, and if there are attacks, you say we need even more money.
Right.
So the question is basically what would be a success?
I guess we've been building around Bush a little bit, but I want to get from your perspective, Dr. Mueller, how do we measure legitimately what would be a fair matrix to say, okay, this is how we know Homeland Security is working, so that we can avoid the obvious problem, which is that you spend more and more money, and if there's no attacks, it's been great, and if there are attacks, then you have to spend even more money. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's right. Well, one of the techniques we've used is a so-called break-even analysis.
Right.
And it falls very naturally, just like four variables. They're all very clear in what they mean and how they put together, and they just a matter of multiplication or division. And essentially what happens is that with break-even analysis, what you try to do is we spent all this money for security. How many attacks would they have had to foil, deter, or protect against to be justified using standard cost-benefit analysis that's been used for decades by risk analysts and people dealing with public safety and other hazards.
Right.
And it comes out to be pretty spectacular. They would have had to deter, prevent, or protect against 9/11 every single year. Or if you think as a sort of the model of a large attack, would be the attack that was attempted at Times Square, something like that. In order to be justify the expenditures, they would have had to have prevented or dealt with or deterred or protected against 4 of those attacks every single day since 9/11 to be justified.
Right.
Now, if you think that they've had that kind of success ratio, that they've deterred or prevented or foiled or protected against 4 attacks, like otherwise successful attacks like that, every single day since 2001, then the money has been well spent. Obviously, that's not very likely, and it suggests that there's been a massive over-expenditure. Also relating a little bit to what you were saying a little bit before, this affects both the international and the local thing. Issue is we find is a massive exaggeration of the capacity of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is looking to me, and this is sort of speculation, but it's looking a little bit like Lee Harvey Oswald. What happened was Lee Harvey Oswald got lucky, tragically, in 1963 and was able to assassinate the president. It's about the only thing he ever did successfully in his whole life. He's basically a pathetic guy who got lucky. And Al-Qaeda is looking increasingly like hasn't done very much of anything except, tragically, on 9/11.
Oh, that's not, come on.
What?
There's been a lot that Al-Qaeda has done and its affiliated groups have done.
Yeah,
they've been responsible for Mumbai attacks. They've been responsible for the attacks in Rawalpindi in Pakistan, Madrid train bombings, the subway attack in London, the Bali hotel attack. I mean, they're a nasty outfit.
That's right, and what you need to do is add up the damage. Some of the things you mentioned were not really done by Al-Qaeda, but done by.
Well, I mean, I think it's splitting hairs. I mean, we could say, the Haqqani network or Ilyas Kashmiri are certainly, in Al-Qaeda's orbit. I mean, Ilyas Kashmiri is, on the one hand, he's part of that Huji group, but he's also has been described as a military commander for Al-Qaeda, and there is a lot of overlap there.
Right. But what you have to put together, basically, is the amount of destruction that Al-Qaeda has been able to do since 9/11 outside of war zones. War zones get very complicated because you're fighting an actual war and everything. And that's what they include Mumbai, it would include all the things you mentioned, London, Bali, Madrid, and so forth. Those are all tragic and horrible, and I don't want to downplay that at all. But if you add up the total number of people killed in all those attacks, plus a lot of smaller ones around the world, and that's what the Americans are worried about. They're not worried about the country becoming another Iraq or another Afghanistan, but rather attacks, sporadic attacks. It comes out to be maybe 200 to 400 people per year, every year, roughly.
Oh, and then with the analysis that you had on how much that's worth, we start to come to a number.
Yeah, and it comes to basically to 200 to 400 people in the whole world outside of war zones per year.
Right.
And there's about 3 or 4 different people who've sort of tallied that, and it's easy enough to put together. So what you're dealing with is those are tragedies and outrages and so forth, but it's not terribly significant in the course of world history. By comparison, the number of people who die drowning in bathtubs in the United States each year is about just in the United States, is about 320. So I don't think they're not comparable. Yeah, they're not comparable in a lot of ways, but it gives you sort of a feel for it.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
So what you want to deal with is, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing anything. I'm not saying these aren't bad people out there, but they've never, ever been able to put together anything remotely like 9/11, any more than Lee Harvey Oswald would have been if he continued to probably do his deeds. And so what's happened is, after Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated Kennedy, there was years and years of conspiracy theories saying, well, how could anybody that trivial do such a major deed?
Right.
And so they said he must have had all kinds of people working with him, et cetera, which is basically proved to be nothing. And some of that is happening with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda did this spectacular, unbelievably horrible thing.
Right.
And therefore, they must be giant killers. They must be massive. They must be an incredible threat. More and more, it's looking to me that it seems to be that they just got tragically, from our standpoint, of course, horribly lucky on one day. They've never had, and none of their plans, basically, for the most part, were in that range.
You're thinking of the Bojangles plot and the airlines, stuff like that.
Yeah, well, the airline plot.
The argument that you get from people in the intelligence community is that, because people were doing, things in secret that we can't talk about, a lot worse has not happened that Al-Qaeda wanted to do. And at least, from my understanding, and this is based now on people talking about what's been on the record, from Michael Leiter to other intelligence leaders, that what we found in the compound of bin Laden was clear desire to strike spectacularly again in the United States. So he was trying, but he was failing. And the reason usually attributed to why he was failing is not because of the Department of Homeland Security, but because of the unmanned aerial vehicles and the Pakistani intelligence service and JSOC and yada yada yada.
Yeah, well, they've got the possibility of doing these kinds of things all over the world. It doesn't have to even be in the United States, and what they've been able to pull off has been very limited. The so-called mastermind,
and it's the Muslim world, by the way, that's probably suffered the most casualties from
That's right.
Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-inspired lunatics.
Right. And that has caused a massive reaction against Al-Qaeda, too.
Absolutely.
People, as a matter of fact, do not like to be blown up, whether they're Arabs or non-Arabs. And so some idiot gets up in a Jordanian wedding and blows himself up.
I covered that event. I was stationed in Cairo at the time, and I went to Jordan after that attack. And it was extraordinary. I interviewed the imam of the childhood mosque of Abu Musab Zarqawi, who is from the town of Zarqa, right near Amman, and he was publicly denouncing him to an American journalist. And it wasn't just for show. I mean, you really could tell when you kind of went there that people were just absolutely outraged that someone could send a husband and wife suicide bomber to destroy and kill people in 3 weddings. It was really a turning point. Yeah.
They killed Palestinians and Jordanians. That's what was there.
And the real detail was that he sent a husband and wife to kill themselves in the process of killing people in a wedding. It's beyond depravity. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. It's absurd.
Yes.
It's outrageous and it's depraved. I think that's a good word. And also, when they have done these things, what it's done is turn people against them. In that case, very spectacularly. The same in Saudi Arabia. So insofar as they've been able to do much of anything, which has been, as I said, comparatively limited but tragic, the result has been almost universally negative from their own standpoint.
I think from the perspective of trying to have a wider movement, And if you think of Al-Qaeda as an organization that, according to their rhetoric, was trying to establish a global caliphate, then their tactics and their calling card are the thing that has most undermined that, because that requires lots of people getting behind a global movement. And terrorists tend to be spoilers, destroyers. And so Al-Qaeda is very good at destroying things, but they have been less successful in terms of trying to build, what is a kind of horrific version of a political society, at least as they describe it, something that would apply to the most ascetic and most awful version of Islamic law, as the equivalent of sort of the civil law. But
that's actually like Harvey Oswald. He also had grandiose schemes, and so is Al-Qaeda. It should be pointed out that no Muslim terrorist, Islamic terrorist, since 9/11 in the United States has even been able to figure out how to set off a bomb. And the same goes, except for the underground bombing in 2005 in England, in London, the same goes for the United Kingdom. So mostly, even within its own terms, it's been racked with vastly more failure than success.
Right. Well, I want to get to something, though, that I think there were two things that happened in 9/11. I think that people kind of became very aware of a very poisonous ideology and a subset of Muslims that are at war with the West and hate the West and are very much interested in this kind of fanatical violence. And it's, as I said, a subset, a radical fringe almost. And that is something that we've all dealt with. But then there was this other thing that was obvious, or was kind of clear before, but really was crystallized by the 9/11 attacks. And that is that in our current era, especially when you add to this the prospect of, cyber hackers, causing havoc to our financial system, you have the ability of small, dedicated groups of individuals to do the kind of damage that we used to associate with nation-states. And that, I think, is the reason lurking behind why, when I asked last month, Janet Napolitano, Tom Ridge, and others, when will the national security state established after 9/11 ever recede? They really couldn't give me a scenario where that happens. And I think that's because the people who are responsible for Homeland Security are looking beyond simply Al-Qaeda. They're just looking at the overall risk that, in the future, Bond villains are going to be able to do the damage of nation states.
Well,
do you agree with that?
No.
Okay. But that's what I'm trying to convey what I see as the mindset.
No, I agree that you're right about the mentality, yes.
Okay.
Just the mentality is wrong, it seems to me.
Okay.
I did a book last year called Atomic Obsession. There's 4 long chapters on the difficulties terrorists would have in making a nuclear weapon, for example. I mean, we've got people here who basically can't even blow up a Molotov cocktail. And also, what's interesting is, bin Laden's treasure trove of information seems to be they do sort of vainly or blandly dreaming of doing some sort of attack on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, thinking about that in February, and he can dream all he wants, obviously. But there was nothing in there about anything more cosmic, such as nuclear weapons. In fact,
it looks like it's car bombs or train bombs.
Yeah, he was going to do a train bomb,
Right.
He wasn't going to do it. He just had this idea that maybe we could do that. Then he had any people that could do it, or if they got on a train, the bomb would actually go off. And also, so they've been just very limited in what they've been doing. But most of the transcripts, most of the information, judging from a Washington Post report, suggests that it's in this so-called treasure trove, suggests that they're spending all their time basically dodging drone missiles and then complaining about how they don't have any money.
Yeah.
None of them seem to be talking about, boy, we almost got this uranium thing licked here, in this cave someplace. It just seems preposterous, this ridiculous organization.
Well, I gotta push back a little bit. I think that my understanding is that they have mastered the ability to take castor beans and make a poison called ricin. That's been out there for a while. Apparently, that's right. Pretty nasty. And
it can kill one person if you inject it. Yes, it's a poison. Right.
Okay, but this is something. And the other thing I would say is that, there have been more capable or skilled commanders. When Ilyas Kashmiri was alive, he was generally believed to be the mastermind of the Mumbai attacks, which were not the same as 9/11, but really horrifying. For 24, 36 hours, you had, armed, trained kind of urban commando types, shooting and killing at random people in downtown in the equivalent of New York City for India, and that is not a threat to the United States, but that possibility, which we saw a version of recently in the attack in Israel and Eilat, where you saw these kind of commando teams coming in and just shooting people at random, that's something to be worried about.
Yeah, it's worth being worried about, but again, the total number of people being killed is still, whatever that was, 150 or something like that. It's
not on the 9/11 scale.
And it's still, when you add that up with all the other things they're doing, you're still getting these numbers to 200 to 400. Now, again, I certainly, do not want to dismiss that as a horror.
Right.
And I certainly don't want to justify it in any way, but the point is to keep it in context, and the context certainly doesn't suggest that this is anything like an existential threat to anybody.
Yeah, but I kind of feel that, one of the things that makes the United States what it is that everyone here has confidence that their Friday night football games and their shopping malls will remain unexploded. And that it's that notion that once you think that this is a possibility that could happen anywhere, that's what, made life so horrific and hellish. I've been to Iraq 3 times, but it was that idea that any time, at any given moment, there could be a terrible kind of explosion, in the day-to-day, in your day-to-day life. That I think is why it's different than car accidents and lightning striking and earthquakes and tidal waves.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of a lack of safety.
Yeah, that's why, and I understand what you're saying about the resilience, and that you hear it all the time now from the Department of Homeland Security to the president.
Buzzword, yeah.
They always talk about this idea of resilience. One attack is not going to destroy us, and we are going to come together and do something about it. But I still think that there's just a political imperative that, it would be seen as a great political failure if something significant like that happened. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah. The key thing, as far as we're concerned, in the book Terror, Security, and Money, is you do want to improve public safety.
Yeah.
And so the demand is definitely there, both politically and from the ordinary people. And so it behooves the people spending these hundreds of billions of dollars to spend that money wisely. And if they're not doing sensible analysis, it means that they're spending it on things that strike them, to the top of their inbox. So they may very well, and in fact almost certainly are, spending money, lots of money, on things that reduce the risk very little, but cost a lot of money, when the same money, or less in many cases, could be spent more productively elsewhere. So I don't disagree that they should be concerned about this issue, that they should keep it obviously in context, but it's vitally important that they do it in a sensible manner, unless their budgets are infinite, and they do not have that problem. So our key issue basically on this is that if you're going to do this kind of stuff, you should do the kind of analysis you do with other hazards.
Right.
You don't put earthquake shelters in places that don't have earthquakes. You think about that a lot. In the case of terrorism, for example, our calculations are that to protect an office building, an ordinary office building, of which there are a very large number in the United States, there's a danger, obviously, that you could have a truck bomb like Timothy McVeigh.
Right.
And it's possible to estimate the likelihood of that happening, and you have a historical number. And for the money being spent to protect a building to be justified, the probability would actually have to be 1,000 times bigger than it is according to historical data. Now, if you think that next week this would go up by a factor of 1,000, then you really want to spend a lot of money on it. But that strikes me as being incredibly unlikely.
No. I mean, listen. I think I think first of all, it's amazing that it took this long for someone to actually just try to do the math on it. You know what I'm saying? It's just because your data on this is not necessarily. I mean, I think it augurs in one direction, but I mean, just for people to sort of add it all up, and it's really interesting that there's kind of a political taboo on that. And I guess as we wrap up this discussion, why do you think that it's taken so long for someone to actually kind of pull all this information together?
Yeah, I don't know. It's extremely simple. I mean, we did a calculation about body scanners, because the DHS and TSA were not doing it. And it took, my colleague, Mark Stewart, maybe half an hour to do it on the back of an envelope. And then we kicked it around and improved and got better data and so forth and worked on it for some days. But it wasn't very difficult or very expensive. But they simply haven't done it. That's $1 billion a year being spent on that. There's been this sort of self-licking ice cream cone that you mentioned, or this sort of sacred cow thing about Homeland Security, and sacred cows are always a dangerous situation. And maybe, just barely maybe, things are changing now with the death of Bin Laden, and then also with the financial crunch. We're starting to see quite a few more indications in the media and a little tiny bit in Congress about maybe we should look at this whole Homeland Security problem more carefully. Are we really spending the money effectively? And if the book helps to get that dialogue going, what we would call an adult conversation about terrorism, both Mark and I would be extremely happy, I can assure you.
What are you saying to the person that say if you announce that you're spending far less money on Homeland Security, you're like inviting the terrorists to just come back and strike again?
Well, they can come back and strike again anytime they want now. I mean, it's not very difficult to kill a few people. You can be done with a gun or a pistol. You can be done with a knife. The issue about cutting back expenditures would be cutting back expenditures that don't reduce the risk enough to justify their cost. Let me give you an example, which is your chance of being killed in homicide.
Right.
By homicide is about 1 in 22,000 per year.
Right.
Now you can improve your chances by not engaging in the drug trade and a few other things, not working down dark alleys, or living in a safe neighborhood.
Right.
And people are care about that a lot and spend money to
Sure.
buy more expensive houses there. Another thing you could do would be to hire a personal bodyguard.
Right.
And virtually no one does that. And what they're saying is that the cost of the bodyguard, even though it would reduce my chances of being killed, being a victim of homicide, is not worth the value. And in many cases, that's what's happening with Homeland Security. We're spending tons of money to try to reduce a risk, and the costs much outweigh the value. And essentially what we're doing is buying a lot of bodyguards, and that's not cost effective given the current situation in terms of probabilities and the consequences of an attack. So the point is, people do that.
Yeah.
I mean, if personal safety was all that mattered, everybody would go bankrupt hiring bodyguards because they can't live with just one chance in 22,000. They want to make it one chance in 22 million or something like that. But they don't do it. And even though that would have the desirable effect of reducing the risk, people don't say it's not worth the money to reduce the risk, so I'll live with a higher risk.
Well, let me just close on this. Do you think that the citizenry should demand of our elected leaders that they tell us when the big war is over and when we win?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. We actually end the book dealing with that issue, and I must say we're not exactly what you'd call optimistic.
Right.
During the Cold War, there was a similar kind of thing, which is about hunting after domestic communists. They were all over the place, under the bed, and so forth. And the FBI, et cetera, gets money, spending, researching, opening cases, going through garbage and everything.
Right.
To the end of the Cold War, still looking for communists. They found virtually none.
But we knew.
No public attention.
Some people, like Ronald Reagan,
terrorism.
knew what the Cold War would look like when it ended. I mean, it was.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
What you could do, the benefit is that you could actually end the Cold War. Communism could die.
Right.
So I assume that the FBI is not spending a whole lot of money chasing communists that
Right.
hardly existed during the Cold War. The problem is with terrorism, it can never go away. I mean, anybody can, get a gun or
Right.
a knife and shoot up someplace and yell various political slogans. There's no way to stop that anymore. There's possibility of stop it completely any more than you can with crime. And they're already spinning it out. You mentioned it a little bit earlier. They're saying, well, we have to worry now about these guys in Yemen. What have these guys in Yemen done? Well, they sent the underwear bomber over. I guess that was some sort of technological advance over 10 years from the shoe bomber, and he had the same result. And they also tried to bomb a cargo plane with hardly anybody on it.
They also nearly killed Prince Nayef in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that's right. They tried to get with a rectum bomb. The guy only killed himself.
Yeah.
Didn't even hurt the bomb. The Saudi prince, and that's sort of it. And with this cargo plane that they tried to blow up, in one of the packages that had the bomb in it, they put a copy of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. They said, well, because we were expecting great things to happen. Well, nothing has happened. Nothing happened. Of course, that plot was completely disrupted.
Right.
The amount of damage it would have done would be quite limited. And they haven't done anything since. If this is the new Al-Qaeda, not that they can't do damage, not that they're not bad guys, not that they're out to do bad things, not that they're not out to do bad things, but it doesn't look like a cosmic threat to me at all.
So, to sum up, you can sort of understand the rationale for, like, America World Police, but get a grip when it comes to, body scanners and all the other money for the Homeland Security.
Yeah, well, what should be happening?
I know I'm greatly, I'm disposing with all nuance and just summarizing, as journalists will occasionally do. But I kind of, what I hear from you is you're sort of saying, listen, there have been plots disrupted, and there's things that happen, in the intelligence realm largely, but also in other areas, where you can say that, that's at least we can measure the progress. But in terms of the domestic side of this, it's like out of control.
Yeah, substantially.
Yeah.
It seems out of control, and when you look at specific cases, it seems to be there in cost. The measures, they don't look cost effective.
Right.
They're basically buying bodyguards. But the key issue from our standpoint is not so much our conclusions in that sense, because we certainly don't cover everything, but all expenditures should go through that same kind of analysis. And otherwise, you don't know whether you're making. In some cases, the expenditures may have been really smart and really helpful. In which case, say, good, go for that. But they haven't done that kind of analysis, so we don't know which ones may have actually reduced the risk significantly to be worth their cost, and which ones have not. And that's something that can be done. It's a standard thing. We illustrated in various ways in the book for airlines, for protecting bridges, and a bunch of other things. Talk about it in terms of domestic policing. And that's a kind of dialogue, that's a kind of discussion that ought to be happening, and simply hasn't happened yet.
Okay. Well, this has been really helpful, and I hope that the Blogging Head viewers like it. I am now with Newsweek and the Daily Beast. Dr. Mueller's with Ohio State University, and I've really enjoyed this. Thanks so much for doing it.
Thank you. So did I. Great talking to you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.